there guys, I'm so happy to finally be back for a From the Notebook video. It feels like it's been forever. I know that you didn't really miss me because you had Michaela, and really, why do you need me when you have Michaela? Today I want to do kind of a follow-up video to the spring break TBR that Michaela and I filmed before I left for my road trip. Before I left for my road trip, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, by the way, there's a link down below to a post where I explain where I was for spring break and what we were doing. I'm not really gonna go into all that in this video. This is specifically about my bookish habits and kind of what happened to my TBR on this road trip. So while I was on my road trip, I thought that I was going to have a lot of time to read, a lot of time in the car, a lot of downtime at motels where we were just exhausted and didn't want to do anything. And all of that happened. It really honestly did. We were in the car for 10 hours a day on some of our different tracks going, from California to Washington and back. So that TBR that I gave you guys a couple of weeks ago really should have been possible to complete, and considering how fast I read, honestly, I'm pretty sure that it was. Out of the entire TBR that I gave to you guys, I managed to read one of those books, and that was my ARC, Tell the Wind and Fire by Sarah Reese Brennan. This is important for a couple of reasons. One, it was one of the books that I knew I had to read because that book is coming out soon and I needed that ARC review done. But also, it was one of the few books in that TBR that was a Kindle book. This became important to me in a way that I had not even thought of, because if you go back to that TBR, like I said, most of the books besides Tell the Wind and Fire that I put on it were physical books. And yes, I packed all of those books in my backpack. I carried them around everywhere, through the airports, on the road trip. They were with me. It wasn't like they weren't accessible, but they didn't get read. Well, actually, I did start Lady Midnight and I did start Get in Trouble. Both of those are halfway or a quarter of the way done, and Station 11 I just finished for the Bibliomancy episode that just happened, but I read that here. So yes, if you've seen Goodreads updates, those are all happening, but not on the road trip. The reason why I started reading more electronic books over my physical books was one very simple thing: light. I know that sounds so weird, but it's true. When we were in the car, I didn't really do any reading. I spent most of that time hanging out, talking to Rachel, who I really hadn't seen in months. And so we were talking, we were driving, we took pretty coastal highways, so I wasn't reading in the car. So when I was reading, I was in motels and hotels afterwards. And it became so much easier to read on, actually my phone, as opposed to a physical copy of the book, because like Rachel would be asleep, or there just wouldn't be a lot of ways to have light in the room without turning on an aggressive amount of lights. And like I said, if Rachel was sleeping or lying down, it just didn't work to have a physical book out. So I would get out my phone and I would read on my Kindle app on my phone. So that was the first reason why I think more Kindle books got read while I was on my road trip, which is literally all that got read. It was 4 Kindle books. So the second part of this you might notice is that I said I read 4 books, but the only one that came from my TBR was Tell the Wind and Fire. And that was also the only book that I read that I hadn't read before. While I was on the road trip, I was really tired when we came in at night. I really didn't have a lot of mental mind power to read. So I didn't want to read books that I hadn't read before, because I wanted to be able to give those books the attention that they deserved. Especially, like I said, I started reading Lady Midnight on that road trip, but I mean, that's a new Cassandra Clare book, new characters, new time. Well, it's a couple of years later than the Mortal Instruments, but whatever. So I didn't want to read that when I couldn't give it 100% of my mind. And so after I got through Tell the Wind and Fire, I started rereading books, specifically books that I knew were fun and that I enjoyed, but didn't require a lot of my brain. So when I talk about books that don't require a lot of my brain, they tend to be like these mind candy books that I fully admit aren't the best written books that I've ever read, but they're fun and they're exciting, and that's why I read them, because I know that I'm gonna get a smile on my face. The theme that erupted out of the 3 books that I read, and if you saw our weekly wrap-up, you already know what they are, but they were 2 books by Tallulah Darling and 1 book by Amy Carter, and they all centered around the Hades and Persephone myth. I honestly don't know how that happened, except for that they are some of the more recent books that are in my Kindle app, but I literally wanted to read the Tallulah Darling books. Out of all of them, I wanted to read them, and it's the books 2 and 3 of her Blooming Goddess series, My Date from Hell and My Life from Hell. And I don't even know necessarily what inspired me to want to read them, except for those books are just so over the top sassy and funny. And they're not well written, but they're very fast, and they're lovely, and I just did a series review of them as well if you want to check this out. But that's what I wanted. I didn't want to read a new book. I wanted that book that I knew wouldn't ask much of me, but would give me a good time. And so I read the last 2 books in that series, like I said, and then I happened to read Goddess Interrupted by Amy Carter, which is the 2nd book in her Hades and Persephone trilogy, and my favorite out of all of them. I'm doing this video in part because I'm answering actually one of my own questions, and my question about why, when I'm at school, I tend to, if I'm reading, be rereading. I have this whole shelf of books that are new books to me that I haven't read, but when I'm here, I pick up my Throne of Glass books, which I have here, that I have read before many times, or I go back to my Kindle and I read books on my Kindle that I've read before. And it just seems so weird to me that that's what I do when I have all of these books at my disposal that I haven't read yet and would give me a new story, something I haven't read. And for me, this is illustrating what you just sometimes need, and that is, when I'm at school, my brain is being used in so many different ways, and I really don't have the time and energy or want to devote half of my brain to a book that I haven't read before. It's still a really frustrating thing about my reading that I know now, because there are all these new books that I really want to read, like especially right now Lady Midnight by Cassandra Clare. I want to read that so badly, but I'm pretty sure that unless I read it in snippets, which I really don't want to do, I won't be reading it until May, because I'm graduating in May and I have so much homework to do. So I guess this is kind of an apology for the way that my TBR ended up, as well as kind of a revelation to me that I've known, I believe, subconsciously for a really long time about my reading, but now just kind of clicked into place in my head. And I was really curious if you guys find the same thing happening to your reading, even when you have this new book that you really, really want to read, but you just can't, or if you deal with stress and brain power and tiredness and how that affects your reading in different ways. So it'd be really interesting to hear from you guys down in the comments, and that's all I have today. So thanks guys, see you soon.